One, two. All right, guys. Welcome to the weekly Mac Forum chat. We're going coming at you on Monday this week instead of our usual Sunday night time slot. In part because I wanted to be sure that I got information out to you about the Apple Keynote in a timely fashion. But before we do that, let's go ahead and do a real quick forum roundup. First of all, want to say welcome to our newest member. Looks like it's Horatio A13. Welcome, Horatio A13. And welcome to all of our other new members that have joined during the previous week. I hope that you're enjoying your time in the forum and that you'll find some useful information here. First of all, let's take a look at a couple of things and just real quickly in the forum roundup that you might want to check out. We have a really good thread going about backups, the necessity of backing up, the importance of redundancy in backups. And that thread got going long enough that it spun off a new thread focusing on some backup issues with using Time Machine. And I'll have a link to that thread. One of the issues that came up in that thread was some misconceptions, maybe, about the way Time Machine behaves itself. One of our members, I think, was under the impression that when Time Machine ran, it backed up all of your data every time that it ran, which obviously, given that it's set to run once an hour automatically, it would start to take up an obscene amount of space in a very short amount of time. That's not what happens. Just to real quickly clear up that misconception, what happens is the first time that you run Time Machine, it creates a complete backup of everything on the drive, excluding anything that you have chosen to exclude. For example, I've gone into the preferences on Time Machine and I excluded some virtual machine files for Fusion so that my virtual Windows partition doesn't get backed up every time, because that's a file that's going to change every time you open it, and it would take up a huge amount of space very quickly. For, once you do the first uh, backup, subsequent backups do not make copies of the entire drive. What they do, and this is a little confusing, I'll have some links to some follow up information in the show notes, but let's say that you've done your first backup and everything's cruising right along, and you make changes to 5 documents on your Mac in the next hour. Those 5 documents will be added to the backup, and the actual documents will be copied to the backup. Everything else that hadn't been modified is going to, the operating system and Time Machine create what are called hard links to the actual file. And that way, it does not have to back up that file all over again. It doesn't have to keep repeating itself and taking up obscene amounts of space. Um, Also, these backups are normally not stored internally on your machine. Okay. Time Machine relies on you having an external hard drive attached to it. There are two exceptions to this. One of them is if you're using an Apple laptop, a MacBook Pro, and you're away from your external Time Machine drive, then your Mac will store backups, what are called local snapshots, internally until you can reconnect to your external hard drive. The exception to this is if it starts to run out of space, then it'll start obviously cannibalizing those backups to make some extra space, drive space. Now, the other instance where time machine backups are stored internally is something that you can do, but it's not something I recommend, particularly if you have uh, one of these Macs that has flash memory installed, where you don't have maybe a huge amount of drive space. You could partition your main drive in your Mac and put your time machine backups on that partition. The reason I don't recommend it is um, when you do that, if you were to have some kind of failure, say the drive controller chip on the logic board or the hard drive fails or anything like that, you've got a single point of failure. In other words, your backup data is gone along with the original if it's on that same drive. So you always want to be sure that you're using a external drive as your main reason for backing up time machine. I'll link to, as I say, I'll link to that thread and maybe have some more thoughts about time machine. I wrote about time machine in the blog a while back, but it's changed a bit since then, so it might be time to revisit that. A couple of other things that are coming up that I want to wrap up on the forum. Um, People are finding sometimes a little bit of confusion about how do you prepare your Mac for sale now that so much of the Mac software is being distributed through the App Store and linked to your Apple ID. There's a thread there where one of our members is preparing a Mac for sale, and he had some issues with trying to make sure that that Mac was no longer linked to his Apple ID. I'm going to refer you to a specific post in there because of some questions that came up. There's a specific sequence of things that you really kind of need to do to make sure that that's done okay. I'll link you specifically to the post. Apple has some direction on this as well. What you're literally going to do is to disassociate your Mac from your iTunes account and from your App Store account. The problem with that is if you don't do it in the correct way, when you try to reinstall the operating system and give the new owner a clean slate, then it's going to reassociate itself with your Apple ID. There's a specific way that you can go about doing this. It's relatively easy. It's a little difficult to explain verbally. I'll have the written directions for how to do that in the show notes. Also, another one that came up for us this week, another thread that generated a lot of good discussion, just real quickly, had to do with some image capture questions and copying documents. What would be the best settings for that? Being able to reduce the size of documents when they take up too much space. There's some good discussion and good thoughts in there. Uh, do keep in mind when you're scanning documents, one of the things I want to point out to you, unless you use character recognition software, OCR software, when you scan a document into your Mac, what you're actually doing is taking a picture of it essentially, and it won't be editable. And depending upon the document, how many pages, what some of your settings are, this can take quite a bit of space, a considerable amount of space, particularly if your scanner is defaulted. If you've set your scanner to something like a TIFF file, which can take up huge amounts of space. So there's some thoughts there that will probably help you and kind of clarify the situation a little bit. You'll see some interesting ideas for how to get around that. In my traversing's around the web this week, I ran into Kirk McLaren, aka Kirk the iTunes guy. He has some previews of the changes in iTunes 12.4 With the 12.4.1 update, there have been some interface changes. A couple things have gotten moved around a little bit. He has a really good description of what has been changed. If you're finding iTunes a little confusing, this might be a good place to start. I'll have a link to that, of course, as well. One of the things that you can try in iTunes too, and I was so glad I stumbled onto this second article from Kirk because it talks about a couple of features that I've known about in iTunes, but have not always used them perhaps as well as I could. It has to do with what happens if your sound in iTunes does not quite sound as good as maybe you like. There are some things that you can do within iTunes to enhance your sound. First of all, you can change some of the equalizers. There are a multiplicity of built-in equalizer settings, and he goes through how you apply those. It's relatively simple. You're going to select the track, bring up the equalizer window, and work from there and apply it. If you select multiple tracks, you can uh, get get that applied to any of the tracks that you select. I've done entire albums that way, where I select all the songs in the album and apply the particular equalizer that I want. But one of the reason I linked to this article is that he discusses a little bit a feature that I have not really used very much because I had not seen a good description of what it does. And over the years, there's been various degrees of agreement over just how well it works. But it's a feature called normalization. Now, the best way I can explain what happens with normalization is, let's say that you've built up a playlist in iTunes and it's got songs from maybe different bands, different albums by the same band. The key thing here is that the sound is not always recorded at exactly the same level. So you start playing one song, you get the volume adjusted to the way that you like it, and then the next song in the list is either significantly louder or significantly quieter, and you have to go in and adjust the volume again. And then the third song comes along, and maybe you're back where you started from. Um, the sound check function in iTunes brings up basically a solution to that, and it tries to do what's called normalization, where essentially normalization analyzes the music in your library and tries to get things to a somewhat consistent level. Some audio files do not like this. Others find that the change in the music is not annoying to them, and in fact is somewhat beneficial because they don't have to keep playing around with the volume on their devices. So I'll have some links to that to give you an idea of what that means, and he has a good description in there that I prefer to just about any description that I have read recently. And the only thing I can suggest to you is try it and see if you like the result. And now that we've done a real quick forum roundup and a couple of other interesting little tidbits here and there, and there's tons more stuff in the forum that's really interesting. These are just the threads that kind of stood out for me this week. There were one or two more today that have been fairly active. I haven't put a link to those in the notes yet, just because I kind of want to see what develops a little bit with those. But uh, of course, everybody today is talking about Apple's keynote address this afternoon from their public event. As we expected, they did announce some things, some software and other service changes. First of all, let's kind of get a real quick overview. Uh, what they did, as they did in the last event at Worldwide Developer Conference, is kind of give you an overview of where things are, in the sense that we now have approximately 13 million registered developers working for Mac apps and iOS apps. And 70% of the attendees at WWDC were new people, if I remember correctly, new developers. Uh, there were 100 developers that were under the age of 18, and the youngest was 9 years old. Okay, that's kind of, I'm kind of ashamed to admit it, but given how poor my coding skills are, I can guarantee you that 9-year-old codes way better than I do. But because of that kind of active developer environment, the App Store recently topped 2 million apps in place, and approximately almost 50 billion, with a B, $50 billion paid out to developers. And so this is their annual event to kind of bring a bunch of developers together, show everyone where they see the vision of the Mac and the whole Apple ecosystem going. And they broke things down again into four different areas: the Mac OS, iOS, the iPhone operating system, or the, I should say, the iDevice operating system. That would be a better way to put it. Uh, the Watch OS, and then the last, of course, is looking at all of the things with, of course, on top of Watch. Then you have Apple TV. So you've got the Watch OS, the TV OS, iPhone operating system or iOS, and the Mac. And let's just kind of walk through them really quickly, just to give you some ideas of what's going on. This is not everything that was covered in the keynote. It's just kind of some of the highlights that caught my attention. Some of them I think are going to be really interesting. And I must admit, I'm going to have to go back and watch the keynote. I kind of rushed through it, fell asleep a little bit on it there, missed a little bit of one part of it. So I'm going to have to go back and listen to it. And unfortunately, you can't scrub through the whole thing yet. I haven't figured out a way to do that yet. I'm going to have to go back and listen to the whole thing just to catch the parts that I missed. But here are some of the things that caught my attention. I don't have an Apple Watch. So when the new Watch OS goes to beta, I'm going to have to keep an eye out and see if these stats are true. But I can tell you that looking at it in the keynote, it seems that way. Uh, One of the things that's been done to the Watch OS is to give you a way, first of all, apps launch faster. A lot of the Watch OS applications launch faster than they did. It, in some things, it is almost instantaneous. Second one of the other changes, and I'm going to put this in the category of something that I used to call perceived speed on the Mac, and I think this is going to be even more true on the Watch. To me, perceived speed is how long an app takes to launch is only half of the equation. How long does it take you to get to the information that you need, or to get to the point where you can interact with it in a useful way? In other words, if an app starts launching, gets through its launch screen, but you've still got to wait while everything catches up, that doesn't help you. Well, that's not what's happening now. With the Watch OS, they've allowed background updating of info. So you've got, let's say you've got a sports application on your watch that tracks sports scores. That application could update that information in the background. And then when you tap and bring that application to the front on your watch, it's going to come up with the score. None of this, in the past, what's happened is it would bring up the application and start the application, but then you had to wait for the score updates to load. Well, that loading process disappears because the information is loading in the background. Okay, it has it keeps some of the info in memory, and this is going to be allowed for Apple applications as well as third-party applications. The demo of the speed difference is quite impressive. For some applications, it's going to be as much as 7 times faster. It's going to have the watch equivalent of a dock, essentially, and it adds a control center by simply swiping up. And it allows you to change some settings on the watch, much like the control center in the iPhone does. You can switch more. There are a few more faces now that you can use, including Minnie Mouse. And some of the apps have common functions, such as the timer. You can go right to it. When you open the timer, for example, they've got some predefined things. 1 minute timer, 5 minute timer. I think there was a 30-second one. So you can go right to it without having to go through a complicated setup. Uh, they're going to be one of the other things that I found really interesting. And this is something that I must admit, I thought about a while ago on the Apple Watch, and it looks like they've addressed this issue. You know that if you're into fitness, the Apple Watch can track your movements, but and give you some ideas about how much you're moving, what your activity level is. But I realized right away that it wouldn't work well for me because uh, of me using a wheelchair. It has no way to track steps or the equivalent of steps. And there are some other issues if you're involved in very small movements out of necessity. So one of the things I was really impressed to see is Apple has tried to accommodate the fact that the tracking software that tracked the number of steps did not work well for people who are in wheelchairs. They paired with a couple of organizations that have been heavily involved in uh, fitness for those who are wheelchair bound, and they noticed about 4 different types of patterns to the way that people normally push chairs, and have tried to make the application adapt a little bit and give you a somewhat more accurate reading of your activity level if you happen to be in a wheelchair. I don't know yet how well that's going to change tracking uh, of small movements, and I'm going to be curious to see when the new Watch OS comes out this fall, how well that's going to work. It looked really interesting. Second thing I liked about the Watch OS, they have built in what you might refer to as an SOS function. If you've seen these devices, for example, these pendant type devices that someone can push when they've had a fall or they have some kind of medical emergency, they've built that kind of functionality into the watch. And there's a couple things that it can do. First of all, if you're here in the US, the watch will be smart enough to be able to dial 911. It waits a couple of seconds after that push to see if that's what you really want to do. But once it does, it can dial 911. It can give your location, and it can also pass that location with a map onto someone that you designate as a contact person. So if you have a friend or family member that comes to check up on you and they kind of need to know where you are, it can do that. And here's the thing that I find really interesting. Some of you may know, those of you who follow the forum internationally, you know that in your country, the number to call in case of emergency is not 911 usually. That's okay. The software, when you set it up for whatever your country is, will know what the appropriate number is to dial, which I thought was an interesting touch. And it might mean that some of the folks who are carrying pendants uh, may not need to carry that. They may be able to carry the watch and have the watch do what the same function. It also is going to have, I think, a little more capability in terms of storing some important information, such as things that you're allergic to. That's going to be an interesting thing to see. Uh, and the Watch OS is going to be released later this fall. If things stay on their usual schedule, the way it has in years past, I would expect it to be probably uh, late September to mid October, somewhere in that range. For the TV OS, you now have approximately 1,300 video channels, 60 more than 6,000 native apps that are running on the Apple TV device. If you got the most recent version of the Apple TV, there is now a remote app for the iPhone that will allow you to control the Apple TV from your iPhone. Um, and of course, it's still got the Siri remote. They provided the remote with some better search capability so that you can do more complicated searches, including search by topic. That's going to make it easier. Um, and it's also another thing that they did that's kind of interesting. Some of you that use some of these TV services, such as ESPN, HBO, most of these things have an authentication procedure where you have to they put a code up on the Apple TV screen. Then you've got to go to your web browser, punch in that code. That's what authenticates that you have the right to view the content. Apple has now kind of rigged this in a way where you authenticate one time and it unlocks these services that you're entitled to see. No more having separate codes for each one. I think that's going to be a big boon for those who have that feature. I don't think I'm going to get that because I'm still one generation back on the Apple TV, but that's okay. Um, Moving on now to, and again, the TV OS release date seems to be probably same time period, uh, fall, which, as I say, is probably going to be uh, anywhere from mid-September to early October, usually. Uh, with regard to OS 10, they're changing the name. They're not going to refer to it as OS 10 anymore. It's going to be Mac OS, and this iteration of Mac OS is going to be called Sierra. They continued with the use of California place names in the title of the operating system. It's going to focus a lot on continuity, and it includes things, continuity, for example. A good example would be if you have an iPhone and you have FaceTime set up on your Mac and on your phone. If you're running um, El Capitan, when you get a phone call on your phone, you can easily pass that phone call over to your Mac and work with it from there without making a new phone call. Well, they're going to keep that feature, but they're going to add some other things to it. For example, when you do things like passing information, you'll be able to take information, for example, that you've copied to the clipboard on your phone can now be passed to your Mac without really syncing your phone. So if you, let's say you find a map online during the day on your phone, you get home and you've put some things on that map, you've marked them off, you want to pass that to your Mac. It's been kind of a pain to do that in the past. Now you can just kind of cut and paste that into an application that's on your Mac. A couple of other things you can do continuity wise, things like if you have an Apple Watch, uh, and you're ready to log into your Mac, you won't have to type your password because you've authenticated the watch. It will know that you're you when it sees that code that's on the watch, and it's done through some, yes, it's network communication, but it's a little bit different from Wi-Fi. I think it's using something similar to what's called near field communication. Another example of something you can do with that, Apple Pay is now coming to the Mac itself. So you can make use of Apple Pay as more and more online vendors put Apple Pay capability into their website. And as a means of authenticating a purchase, let's say you're making a purchase on your Mac and you've got your iPhone right there handy, because your iPhone can use your thumbprint as an authentication means, you can use that thumbprint on those websites that are Apple Pay enabled. They demonstrated it earlier today on a couple of websites. It's going to become probably more widely used now that it's going to be available um, in the operating system itself. They're going to do two other things that really stood out in my mind, and these are the two that I think are the big deal. I may change my mind after I experiment with them a little bit. Usually, when one thing comes out in the OS, I think, "Oh, that's going to be the coolest feature," and then after I experiment with it a little bit, I find that something else is more helpful. But the two that I think are going to be really interesting are Siri is coming to the Mac, and it's capable of doing complex searches. Uh, the best way I can explain that to you is go into the keynote and watch that. It occurs in probably about the first 20 minutes or so of the keynote. It can do some pretty complicated searches just based on what you tell it, and then drill down into those searches even farther. You can grab one of those search results and drag it into another application that you're using. The whole setup there is going to be toward more passing information more easily back and forth between your Mac and other parts of the Apple ecosystem. And then the other thing that I see is they have a means in there of optimizing storage. Let's say you're running out of space, then this will look at your iCloud drive setup, as well as some other issues, and try to identify what it can move around, shift around, etc., to create more space, either by loading some of it onto your iCloud drive, doing some other things. The demo that they gave was on a machine that went from having 20 gigabyte of free space available. After they ran the routine, it had 150 gig because of moving some things, relocating some files to other storage locations, and that kind of thing. Whether that's going to be useful or not depends on how much control you have over what it moves to where. For example, there are some people that are probably not going to want their files on iCloud Drive, or don't want certain types of files on there. I'm going to be curious to see how much you, as the user, have control over that. I suspect that over time you'll grow to have quite a bit of control over that situation. And then several changes to the iPhone operating system with iOS 10, which is going to be the new one. And of course, it has some of the iPhone features have been enhanced a little bit. You have when you put a web link in a message, for example, it's a much richer multimedia type experience, or can be. You can use raise to wake now. We've had a situation in the past where if you went to wake up your phone, let's say you got a beep on your phone that tells you had a text message. You went to use your phone, and of course you have to put your fingerprint in or your user ID. And when you do that, sometimes the message disappears. So with raise to wake, when you raise the phone, you can that wakes it up, and your lock screen is right there. And whatever it was that you were alerted to pops up on the lock screen. And more third party applications are going to be doing things where they can interconnect and talk with each other, and sometimes be able to see the result on the lock screen. But one good example of something where you'll see applications integrated and talking to each other. Let's say that you're driving around, you're ready, you're getting a little hungry, you want to eat seafood. You have Siri search for seafood restaurants in your area. Now, in the past, what that's meant is when you found a restaurant that you liked, you maybe had to go out into another application to start the whole process of making a reservation. With the level of integration that's going to be available and the little more openness to the iPhone operating system, some of these apps are going to be able to um, simply, when you get the result, you would be able to go in and make your reservation without ever opening that third party app that you used to have to open. As long as the app is there, Siri would be able to handle it and make the appropriate reservation. One other thing I want to mention about something that's coming to the Mac OS itself is this idea of tabs, which we know from Safari is going to be available in other applications. So if you've got multiple maps open, for example, that can have a tabbed interface, and so that each map could be in a different tab. And that apparently, if I'm understanding the keynote correctly, is going to be handled at the operating system level, so your applications, individual applications, would not have to be completely rewritten to take advantage of that. All right, guys, that I tell you, that squeezed a lot of stuff into a relatively short amount of time. There's several things that I'm excited about. I am, of course, going to sign up for the public beta program. I was in the public beta for El Capitan. I enjoyed it. Only reported a couple of bugs, mainly because my my version of El Capitan has always run pretty well. I did not see anything on system requirements yet. I haven't had a chance to research that a little bit. Didn't see it in the keynote. I might have missed it. It looks to me like if your system is running El Capitan, then you'll be able to run um, the new Sierra. Now, if that's the case, that's going to surprise me a little bit because my 2008 MacBook Pro runs El Capitan reasonably well. It's not as fast as my newer machine, but it's pretty good. So if Sierra doesn't take any more system resources, or there's not some other little hink that I'm not aware of, I'll be able to run it on even some machines going back to 2008, which will be a real interesting thing. I personally was not expecting that. So hopefully that's good. Like I say, there's a lot of things that I'm kind of excited about. Uh, you know, Maybe I can con someone into believing that I really need an Apple Watch, to help me get in shape. I don't know. I don't know if that's going to work, but meanwhile, the wife is screaming in the background that it's not going to happen. But hey, it was a good try while it worked. Maybe you can all send me email guaranteeing that I get encouraging me to get an Apple Watch or something. I don't know, but I did see several things today that looked interesting to me. A lot of it is Some of it is new things that haven't been available before, but some of it is polishing, refining features. Take that example of having something in the keyboard in the clipboard on your phone and being able to paste it over to the Mac without a big hassle. As soon as I saw that, my brain said, "Well, duh, why haven't we been able to do that all along?" When they talked about changing in clipboard, I thought what they meant is they were going to integrate, some of these third party apps allow you to have multiple clipboards on your Mac. And that's something you have not been able to do in the Finder without a third party application. And I thought that's what they were aiming at. But this is going to be much more interesting. This integrated clipboard, universal clipboard, is going to be much more interesting and potentially much more useful than just having multiple clipboards available to you. And just before I go, here's a little piece of homework for you guys. I know it's summer, but hey, a little homework won't kill you. um, Other than watching the keynote, which I think you might enjoy, or at least watching parts of it, here's an idea for you that occurred to me about 5 minutes before the show. I haven't tested it yet, but it should work. I've done something similar to what I was thinking. I just haven't completely tested with all the different types of media. If you have an iPhone, you know that there is an application on there called Notes, and that same application is in your OS 10 install under El Capitan. And if you have iCloud, you have an iCloud account. When you make changes in Notes, let's say you start a note on your phone and you make some changes to it. When you get to your Mac, within a few minutes of when you made the change on the note, when you get to your Mac, that note pops up on your Mac. When you open Notes, that note is there with the changes you made, and it works the other way as well. Well, I've used it with text files when I'm preparing show notes, but Notes can also handle drawings and other things. So if you are in a position where you're not going to be able to run Sierra for some reason, or you maybe just don't want to, but you want that integrated keyboard functionality, one way to do that might be to pass information back and forth between your Mac and your phone using the Notes application and an iCloud account. I'll test that in the coming week and give you some ideas next week on the Sunday show about whether you think whether this is a viable option until Sierra comes along. And until then, that's going to just about do it for this week. I know we squashed a lot of things into roughly 45 minutes of information here. I've enjoyed bringing it to you. I hope that you enjoyed it. And until next Sunday, this has been your host, Sylvester Rock, aka Sly Dude on the forum. If you've got a question or a comment about the show, pass it along and let us know. I'll have the show notes up probably early tomorrow morning because it's going to take me a little while to clean up my notes on the keynote. But that's going to just about do it. You'll be able to find a link to all the information that we talked about tonight, including my summary of some of the things from the keynote. So until Sunday night, we'll see you in the forum. Have a good evening, guys.